how it is formed as a kind of experiment in Republican forms of government. And when it is this sort of experiment in Republican forms of government comes about, then there is a desire, of course, to, again, this old-fashioned term, to edify, to build something which symbolizes that unity. What was that unity? There were 3 fortified hill towns in the area, it's the Chianti region of Tuscany, in an area that is quite fertile, very beautiful, in fact. And these 3 hill towns over time began to develop. They were built on ridges. We see that here in the upper left, these 3 towns, and we see a kind of ridge here and a saddle, which is actually right here. And you see it right there. This Piazza del Campo means literally the public place of the field. And what had happened here, beginning in the 12th century, is that a kind of impromptu market had begun to develop, which was shared between these 3 towns. And this sort of led ultimately to a more or less permanent market, and sort of like the Cenoicism that we've talked about in Rome between Latin and Sabine, and possibly Etruscan, in which this political association was formed. Something similar, a similar process happens here, where over time, because of this economic activity, and perhaps even because of intermarriage, the actual motives for this are not altogether clear, but in any event, these 3 towns grow together. Each of these towns was controlled by 3 ruling families, and they formed a council called the Council of Nine. So if you count the wedges in the Piazza del Campo paving pattern, you will see that it's 9 divisions. Today there are 14 of these contrada, which were sort of like political wards, to use the English term, or council districts. And each of these older hill towns, fortified hill towns or burgs, actually contributed 3 members from each one into this Council of Nine. So this process of Cenoicism sees this unfolding over a couple hundred years, where the first sort of collective structure to be built was in fact this very large retaining wall and a drain to control runoff and flooding in this kind of large market space. Each of these hill towns had, as we'll see in a moment, like at San Gimignano just down the road, each of these sort of powerful merchant families actually had fortified houses with towers, sort of compounds that they could defend. These ultimately would go away. Each had its own sort of church, and so thus the motive for creating this large cathedral with the seat of a bishop actually had to do with the unification of these 3 towns. So we see then that eventually they construct a permanent building on the top of that retaining wall facing out, which will become, in fact, the city hall of the city, the town hall. And there we see it in red on the left. It's added to over time, and eventually the market is moved following the advice of Aristotle, who said that all of those market functions should leave the agora and go down to Piraeus where they really belong. That the agora in the Greek city should only be associated with political activities and sort of public life in that sense rather than economic activity. So they move the market. The market actually goes to the lower side of the retaining wall, and eventually there's a prescription, a sort of early kind of zoning ordinance actually, that says that everybody should regulate the heights of the cornices and everyone should tear their individual towers down, because we now will be symbolically representing the unification of these 3 towns in a single tower called the Torre Amangia. So there you see the cathedral. Again, it's the largest, it would have been the largest. The existing building, quite beautiful, that we see here, that's the view of this front that we see here, was intended to be used as a transept, and the nave was actually under construction here. There we see the nave of the basilica form. As a sidelight, I think it's interesting to see the Gothic elements that are merged here in the early part of the 14th, latter part of the 13th, early part of the 14th century with neoclassical elements. So if we look at this, we have clearly a Roman arch up here, but we have squinch arches, Gothic arches that we see here. These sort of quatrefoils that we see, which are typical of Gothic building. However, as I mentioned, the plague hit in 1348, wiping out 2/3 of the population. Had Siena, and from that point on, Siena came under the control of Florence, another city-state, 60, 70 miles down the road, which occasionally fought against Siena. But ultimately, Florence won out, and the entire history of art in the Western world went in another direction. This would indicate to me that the presence of these two sort of forms here, which are by and large incompatible, actually indicates that they were attempting to create a kind of merger between these influences of the Lombardy sort of Gothic north and the Roman world that was all around them. Now, the Sienese today claim descendancy from Rome, but there's absolutely no evidence that there was any Roman settlement here at all. It was actually not a Roman town. So there we actually see this tower, which was cut down, or actually erected at the same time that these others, you see remnants of them here and here, and here were actually lowered. This public loggia, a sort of building, a sort of porch, was added to the front of this for the purpose of celebrations and weddings. And you'll notice here the emphasis on this clock, which is eventually added because of the need, an obsession really, that the Renaissance had with mechanical time. You cannot imagine how important it is that we actually have mechanical time. Otherwise, you might show up and there'd be another class in here. You would go to the airport. The plane would take off whenever. You call someone in China or in India or in England, and they're not there because you don't have standardized time. It doesn't really matter what it is. What matters is that everybody agrees to it. And that is actually representative here of this very expensive device, which was a clock. Now, today, I find it appalling that this is an editorial, shopping malls and other kinds of things out on Roswell Road here might have clocks on them, because the last time I checked, my cell phone has a clock, my wristwatch has a clock, everything has a clock. Time is now portable, and those clocks never work anyway. They're always telling the wrong time. So I think that's an example of some sort of trying to recreate something which, in the context of the present world, which actually doesn't make any sense. This is what it looks like today. It's really quite beautiful, and it's fortunate for us in a way. Their misfortune of losing 2/3 of their population is actually our fortune, because it's a city that is by and large frozen at this moment in time, in the middle of the 14th century, right on the dawn of the Renaissance. Now, if we were to go into the building, the public building of City Hall, we would find a very famous painting in there, which is known as the Allegory of Good Government and Bad Government, painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the years 1337 to 1340, just 8 years before the plague years. And it's notable for two reasons. One, I think we see on the left, ensconced on the throne, the female figure of what was considered to be good government. And then if we sort of expand outward from that, I don't have an example of it, we expand outward from that, we see that the people are happy, the trees are laden with fruit, the harvest is coming in. And then we see the opposite of that, bad government, tyranny, and so forth. And what we see under bad government is that the people are dying, the fields are not producing, everyone is very, very, very unhappy. But more notably, I think, is this depiction of the city itself. And this will become apparent why I think that is important in a moment. So here we have the structure of that, these ridges where the streets were running on the ridges. The retaining wall is constructed right across here, and then in front of that, the city hall with the tower is built. There we see the structure of the piazza. There we see the location of that retaining wall. And then we see the buildings that were built over about a 100-year period in front of it. And then the big street that runs behind actually included public buildings like this loggia. Again, this is for sort of public ceremonies, various kinds of market activities and other things built by the city. Now today, when we go there, it's, everybody's sitting around eating spaghetti and talking about their boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, lover, grandchildren, in my case, or whatever it may be. But again, these piazzas that we tend to idealize, it is important to understand in most cases that these were also the symbols of a form of authority that by and large has left the face of the earth. That, as we'll see particularly in Rome, when we go back to Rome, that things like Piazza San Pietro, as I like to joke, you are a Roman Catholic when you're in that piazza, whether you want to be or not. It's really about it's an extension of the church. It's really about that, and a representation of a form of authority. This is San Gimignano. There we see an example where this Cenoicism did not occur. Very heavily touristed area now, but we still have these towers, notable for their sort of medieval example of these fortified dwellings that were existent in, there we see them actually, existent in Siena until by law and agreement they were all sort of torn down and this one single tower was constructed. I want to go back to show you how these kinds of spaces were actually used, or how this space was actually used for the celebration of an important event, a holiday, a wedding. There's still, of course, a very famous horse race that occurs there on 2 days, one day in July, 1 day in August every year. Really a crazy event called the Palio, which still exists and is a holdover from this period. But there we actually see, this is a wedding, a very prominent citizen, and there we actually see the procession, the wedding procession, moving around in this sort of public space, eventually terminating here in this loggia that was built in front of the Torre Mangia. And there is the view of it today, and the view from the tower. Quite beautiful. The market, as I mentioned, is actually moved down to the lower section of that retaining wall onto a terrace. A second retaining wall was constructed here, and then you see it opening up. The wall of the city is actually back here, and that's some of that agricultural territory that in the Middle Ages was used in time of attack. They could actually produce food inside the wall. Houses are of two types, holdovers from the old Roman world, the sort of palazzo, which is a descendant of the domus, single-family house, often with its own water supply. The ground floor, as you see here, is typically used to quarter horses. A horse was a very expensive thing. Not everybody had them. And then the main living floor, the piano nobile, is up here on this floor. What we would call the second floor, they call the first floor. Most people, if you were me, you would probably have lived in something like this, a sort of an apartment building, holdover from the old insula. The slight difference in that you actually have direct access into the unit, often from the street. But of note is this little shrine that we see here, which is a holdover from the old Roman lararium, the shrine to the lares that would have existed within the house. And here, of course, the old Roman gods have been taken out and Christian symbols have been put in. Each of the contrada had their own sort of church, their own water supply. And I should mention that the Bank of Siena is, to this day, the oldest continuously functioning bank, which we talked about last time, in the world. You'll see a statue here of the Capitoline she-wolf, again claiming a sort of spiritual descendancy, if not actual descendancy, from Rome. And then each of these contrada, as I mentioned, there are 14 of them now. They each have a symbol, and each one has a fountain and a small piazzetta, or public space, which is the sort of space within that section of the city. I should mention before we move on that I was there back about 10 years ago wandering around and wandered into City Hall. I was looking for the painting by Ambrosio Lorenzetti. I stumbled into a city council meeting. They're still meeting in the City Hall building, and they were having a discussion, as best as my weak Italian could make out, about new traffic laws that had to do with permits of who was allowed into the city in a vehicle at what time. I find that fascinating that since 1340 they've been meeting there, and actually here they were discussing traffic, universal problem in cities today. Well, Florence won out. So if we go down the road to Florence, which is often considered to be the sort of spark plug of the Renaissance, I suppose, we see a city that was, in fact, a city of Roman origin. And we, of course, know, most of you know, some of you don't. If you're a business major or perhaps a civil engineer, you wouldn't know, although if you're a civil engineer, you should know. You should learn about Brunelleschi's dome, this thing that we see right here, which was constructed in the latter part of the 1300s and into the early decades of the 1400s. It is a remarkable story, and it's something that I find fascinating because the city council had actually funded to construct, there's going to be some public money in the stadium. So there was public money here where they actually subsidized, in fact, the construction or the reconstruction of a cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. And they built the piers such that, on faith, that they would be able to figure out how to span the distance. They didn't know how they were going to span it, but they went ahead on the assumption that they could do it. I find that remarkable. And Brunelleschi, Filippo Brunelleschi, who is probably the closest thing that we have to a true genius in the Renaissance, actually figured it out. And it's the story of the construction of that dome. Unlike the pyramids, the construction of the dome is quite well known and well documented. There's a very small book written by Ross King, reads like a novel, called Brunelleschi's Dome. Brunelleschi was operating at a time just before Alberti, and he was sort of still half medieval man, half Renaissance man. And what I mean by that is that he was a master builder, that he was given the contract not only to design this, but to construct this. So where Alberti says that the architect, the engineer, should not even see the site, foolish advice, should not even see the site. That, in fact, the intellectual product of the architect should be the drawings and the specification. And that is the paradigm that we've been operating under now for about 500 years. It's beginning to shift with the advent of digital forms of representation and dissatisfaction with design, bid, build, and so forth. We see new forms of project delivery. Well, Alberti was a person who sort of had one foot in the Renaissance and one foot still in the Middle Ages. He was the master builder. So his contract was to deliver the dome, not to design it, to build it. So he was responsible for acquiring the materials, for hiring the labor force, for designing it and engineering it, and getting the whole thing constructed. And they didn't believe that he could do it. So they forced him to work with his a colleague named Lorenzo Ghiberti, who we will meet in a moment, who had recently won a competition to build a new set of doors for the baptistry associated with this building. And Filippo knew that Lorenzo did not know how to build this. Ghiberti did not know how to build this. So they got it halfway up. And then Brunelleschi suddenly got very sick and took to his sick bed saying he was dying. And so all the workers were out hanging around waiting on instructions from Brunelleschi. And he said, "Oh, Lorenzo knows how to do this. Just ask him." And so they do. And Ghiberti, according to Vasari, Ghiberti goes around at night sort of trying to figure things out. And they start construction and it collapses. At which point, after about 4 or 5 months, Brunelleschi makes a miraculous recovery and comes back and takes over the whole thing after he then sort of blackmails, in some sense, the city council into actually funding the whole project. Well, the significance of this was that the only thing in the West that spanned that distance was, in fact, the Pantheon in Rome, which is a poured-in-place concrete structure. The knowledge of how to make concrete fell away completely. Okay? No one knew how to make concrete at this point in time. In fact, it doesn't come back in Europe until the 19th century. Brunelleschi had tried to figure out how to make the stuff, but what he didn't know is that it requires ash in it as a catalytic agent. And that forms then the chemical reaction that causes the lime and the water to bond with the aggregates and to set up the concrete. Well, Roman concrete was pozzolana, which the material came from Bay of Naples, which was volcanic, which had ash already in it, already in the mix. And so he never could get it to set up right, so he invented a whole other way of making a dome, which was a dome within a dome, known as the shell dome. And the significance of that is that every dome, including the one in Washington, D.C. on the U.S. Capitol, the one down here on the state capitol, St. Paul's in London, etc., all the domes built in the entire Western world are all built as shell domes after Brunelleschi had developed this. Now, the significance of this and where it is like the pyramids, if you recall, Mark Lerner had said that Egypt did not build the pyramids built Egypt. That's a rather cryptic statement. I know what he meant. Once you had actually organized yourself, the supply chains, all of the material, the trained workforce, the labor, you don't just build one of them, right? You build several of them. You move on and you build other things. And so, in a sense, the dome built the Renaissance. The Renaissance did not build the dome, right? You're not going to do this just once. It sets in motion, though, a whole series of possibilities, funded, interestingly enough, by the people who occupied this building known as the Orsa Michele, which was the Guild of the Wool Merchants, and the head of the Guild of the Wool Merchants was Giovanni de' Medici. It's not de' Medici, as everybody says. You don't say medical, it's medical, Medici, okay? The Medici family, who became then the patrons, one set of patrons of the sort of that fueled this extraordinary explosion of activity, artistic production, architectural production that we later came to call the Renaissance. Well, now I'm going to test you of what is called a learning outcome. Can anybody find the Roman city there? Pretty clear, isn't it? You see the Cardo? See the Cardo? Decumanus? Guess where the Forum was? Where was the Pomerium? Right? See that? It's extraordinary, isn't it? Now you probably, if you just hadn't had this course, you might not know that, maybe. And you can see, in fact, how this Roman city of Florentina developed around the time of Julius Caesar in the middle of the 1st century BCE, ultimately is still embedded, that constitutional frame is still embedded within the Renaissance city. And there we actually see it quite clearly. The Duomo of Santa Maria del Fiore is here, and in front of it you will see that small little white roofed building, which is actually the baptistry of associated with the church. And there we see it, a very old building, very, very old building. There we see the first church, and then you see a sort of second church, Romanesque, that we see here, and then here you see the expansion of it, and those are the piers that were constructed, funded, with no idea of how they were actually going to span that distance. And there it is, the shell dome as it exists today. Now the other sort of great invention, and Brunelleschi also came up with this, was perspectival space. Perspective actually means literally clear seeing. So it is something which has to do with perfecting a way of seeing so that you could create the illusion on a two-dimensional surface of three-dimensional depth, something that in the Middle Ages they didn't know how to do. They also probably would not have done it even if they had known how to do it, because they were more concerned with the world to come, as Lucretius said in his poem, beyond the flaming ramparts of this world, more than they were concerned with perfecting the seeing of everyday life. This is a very famous painting by an artist known as Cimabue. And it actually is showing, of course, the Madonna and Child enthroned with all the heavenly hosts around her, and then two very important figures down here. I want to point out that there's a sort of an attempt here at creating perspectival space, but you notice how flat it is. Cimabue really didn't know how to do it. And if we look at paintings of this time, it's not only the flatness, it's also the fact that the figures, even though they may be sort of represented no longer as abstractions, but as real people, portraits that we can actually identify, you'll notice that the background is actually just a sort of other world, gold. You'll see the same thing in the Byzantine world. You'll see the same thing where the Pantocrators, the Pantocrator, you'll see the figure of Jesus, or you'll see the angels or something, and they're all just kind of floating like they are puppets or something, hung on strings up in heaven with no depth to the background whatsoever. Just these kind of almost symbols of things pasted flat. Now the Romans knew how to construct perspective. This is actually in one of the rooms recently excavated at the house of Augustus Caesar. And you can see quite clearly the sort of accuracy of this with a horizon line that we see here and a vanishing point in 1 point perspective, which the Romans painted all the time. Now, as these Renaissance artists are beginning to sort of discover and pull up all this material from the classical world, they uncover, dig down, tunnel down into something covered up, and they see this, right? Scrape it all away, and they see something like that, and they become fascinated by this. And it is Brunelleschi who ultimately will create a device that allows you to map the reality of three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface. The person, there it is a little device with a polished, a mirror, basically, and then a peephole, and then you stand with your back to the baptistry and you adjust the length of it so that it actually then comes into focus, and that meant that you could actually map it directly onto a two-dimensional surface. The person who was most associated with this was a painter named Masaccio. This is in Santa Maria Novella, and it's in really bad shape today. It doesn't look anywhere near that good. But you can see how he experimented with all of this. He died at the age of 28, 29, somewhere in there. And he was often criticized by his colleagues for spending far too much time. They thought he was a brilliant painter, but he spent too much time monkeying around with mechanical perspective. The significance of this cannot be underestimated. But before we get to that, let me show you here what I was talking about earlier. This is the same story. This is the Annunciation. For those of you who do not know what the Annunciation is, this woman, Mary, is a young girl, and she has just been visited by an angel. And this angel has told her that she is going to have a child. She is impregnated by God. We can imagine that this is a fairly significant moment in her life, right? To say, well, how is this possible? I haven't had intercourse. I don't know. And says, don't worry about it. You are going to be the mother of the Son of God. No. Wow. So this is a subject that is painted all through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And just to make sure you understand, over and over and over after that, right? So we see here Cavallini painting right on the cusp of the 1300s. And you can see that the throne is grounded. That's a little unusual. But you can see what I'm talking about here in the background, right? There's sort of just this ephemeral quality to it. And even though here we have the beginning by 1330, this is also Lorenzetti, 1330 of something that begins to suggest something similar to what we saw in the Roman mural. But by the time we get up into the middle of the 1400s, 1478 specifically, this painting by Lorenzo de Credi, it's only about that big, it's very small, one of my favorite paintings, is totally constructed around this illusion of great depth into the painting itself. So that if we were to look at Cavallini's painting here, it's as if we were reading a children's book. It's as if we were looking at a kind of map or an illustration of something, right? You follow me? If we look at this on the right, Credi's painting, you are in the painting. You are an eyewitness to the painting. You're in the room. The viewer is. You follow me? So if we look at what's at the center here, it's really the conversation, and there we see the two figures. We still see the conversation and the two figures, but now the center has been evacuated, and the events that are occurring here in this room, this garden room, this kind of loggia, now has the potential, it seems to me, of redeeming this fallen world that lies outside of it. So whereas the medieval world is really only about sort of the bounded interiority, the interior space of a building, a city, a monastery, whatever, this world closed in on itself, what we see here by the middle of the 15th century is something which has now exploded out across the everyday landscape, a word that does not exist at this time, across the everyday countryside, in which the events that are occurring in the narrative of the painting now have the potential of having some effect upon the larger world, not to come, but the world of the here and the world of the now. You see here the story of creation down here at the bottom. Well, it's not surprising that at about the same time we begin to get actual buildings that are constructed this way. This one having been constructed by a pope who, this is his private garden, 1462, from the atrium of his house, looking out to his garden and then to the fields beyond, which we'll see fully in a moment. But it's easier to experiment and work it out on a wall or a canvas. And it's easier to do it in a single building, but to do this in a city is quite difficult, right? How do you do that? Well, this perspectival space becomes really important in the conception of the ideal city, something that the Renaissance now becomes enamored of trying to perfect. And of course, the significance is that you can move human figures or other things around in space according to these sort of rules of vision that were mapped out first by Brunelleschi. And this illusion of depth is quite palpable on a two-dimensional surface. And so it is not surprising that we would then see paintings, not real cities, but paintings and illustrations and manuscripts which are done for wealthy patrons, attempting to show the ideal city, such as this one by Piero della Francesca in 1470. And there we see my Modular Man by Le Corbusier sort of inserted according to those rules and how it works. We see others, by Fra Carnevale and the Ideal City, all of these occurring all within a decade of one another. It's really remarkable. Now, if we were to go north at this moment in time to France or to England, we would not see anything like this. Nothing. It would all still be very medieval. God is up in heaven, surrounded by the heavenly host. Somebody is on a throne. They're all in a kind of walled space somewhere, usually a garden or a room or something. And you don't have this kind of horizontal movement that is implied here. The second thing about this is look at it carefully. We have the Colosseum, we have a sort of Arch of Constantine, we have the baptistry in Florence, we have Roman columns, we have arcades, we have all kinds of elements here from the classical world that have now been stitched together out of this vast shipwreck in order to create in perspectival space the perfection of seeing and the creation of a new kind of city for a new kind of person. So if we compare then Piero della Francesca's Ideal City with that which precedes it by about 120 years of Lorenzetti's Good Government and Bad Government, look at the difference. Look at how here things are sort of, he sort of gives an illusion of depth by simply making the figures smaller. There's some attempt here but it's orthogonal. It's not, see, that's all vanishing in the wrong place. It's all vanishing, continues to vanish somewhere back over in here. It isn't all worked out. And it looks like a collage almost, like these things have simply been layered up one upon the other, whereas in the top, what we're seeing is actually something which one could imagine what happens on the backside of that building, of that round building, right? Well, I mentioned Ghiberti. He was a brilliant artist, and of course the famous doors. I won't tell the story beyond that, except that this is on the other doors. This is actually by Ghiberti, and this is Andrea Paisano. But you see what was on the other doors, and when they decided to make a new set of doors facing Santa Maria del Fiore, he won this competition. It took some inordinate amount of time, almost 3 decades, to complete these doors. These are cast in bronze. It's absolutely extraordinary that he could do this. No, we don't have time to go into all the sort of technical complexities, but casting this in perspective is an astonishing feat. But here he has actually then these Bible stories, which are, now we have all this movement and motion. Things are happening back here. We see the inside of this as well as the outside of this. Another one here. Look at that perspective right there, where we're actually looking down this arcade or through it. There's actually a rod with a curtain, and then we see etched into the pattern of the floor the actual vanishing lines and so on and so forth. That's that's the actual panel right here. The one that's up there on the door now is a replacement. This is the actual one that was at the High Museum on loan for a brief time. So it moves from the two-dimensional surface of the painting to the garden and the villa. As I said, the villa is important because it becomes a vehicle for experimentation. It's still not yet there in the city. However, if you are the Pope and your name is Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, and you're from this little bitty town outside of Montalcino in the Val d'Orcia, you might go back with land that you own and the wealth of your family and reconstruct your hometown according to some of these principles of the ideal city. I think it's fascinating that this was done by a pope, because his house is at A, the church is at B, but he also includes a city hall at D and a loggia at E. So he is now making himself, the church, and the city hall sort of somehow equivalent in this piazza. So there's his house. There we see his interior court that looks out through the garden, very much like Lorenzo de Credi's painting, out to the Val d'Orcia beyond. He included a loggia or a porch on the back that would afford him this view. This view. Extraordinary. Here we are at about G on the map, looking into this piazza that he creates that we see here at number 34. There's the loggia on the right, a new town water supply that he constructs outside of his palazzo, and then the church that we see here with a paving pattern that unifies all of it into a single composition. Into a single composition. The year is 1455. Or thereabouts. Piazza Santissima Annunziata. I will go through this very quickly. I don't believe I have given a test in this class that has not asked a question about the principle of the second man. So you want to pay attention to this. Mentioning tests, by the way, Jennifer and I'm still grading. She's finished. I'm still grading. And we're getting together tomorrow, and you'll get your test back on Friday. Okay? This is in Florence. It is known as the Piazza Santissima Annunziata. And Brunelleschi in 1427 is hired to actually create a new facade for the Foundling Hospital. Foundling Hospital. This is something run by the nuns that were associated with this church, which was for children who were born, it's a birthing hospital, but also an orphanage for children who were born out of wedlock. Through no fault of their own. And while the parents may be condemned, the child would be considered innocent. And so the nuns took care of the child. Then in 1454, an architect who I think is much underrated, Michelozzo, was hired to actually then add to the church of the Santissima Annunziata. And he does an interesting thing. He adds this atrium to it, sort of takes this piece off and rebuilds it. But then he adds across the front of it this portico, which is done in imitation or in respect, following the same sort of rules of proportion, the same language as that which Brunelleschi had done to the facade of the hospital. And then in 1629, some 200 years after Brunelleschi's first move, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger will add another facade opposite that. Bacon's notion of the principle of the second man is that the second person, in this case Michelozzo, or the third person, in this case Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, has the choice of whether or not they are going to make their work something which actually, so that the kit of parts, the whole set of parts, becomes something larger than itself. There would be a tendency today to say, well, Brunelleschi did that over there, so I'm going to one up Brunelleschi and do something else on the church or something else on the other side. But here is something where then what they were after was the objectification of the space itself. Like a large outdoor room, thus the piazza complete with two fountains, and eventually the statue, an equestrian statue of Duke Cosimo de' Medici, who had paid for much of it. That's what it looks like. So there we see Brunelleschi's facade with these medallions by Andrea della Robbia. This statue, the equestrian statue, comes later. And then here is Michelozzo's addition onto the church, which we see peeking out behind. There it is. And then on the left here, on the other side of the piazza, the work of Antonio da Sangallo, 200 years after Brunelleschi's arcade on the other side. Eventually then, a street is cut through the fabric of the city, creating this perspectival relationship between the Piazza Santissima Annunziata, the church, the statue of the Grand Duke who had paid for it, and the Duomo. And so now we have not simply a paving pattern that is trying to unify a church and a palazzo and a city hall, but an actual spatial relationship in perspectival space which forges a palpable relationship between the Foundling Hospital and the church and the Duomo, the cathedral church of the city. We will see then how this in the next lecture, how all of this is ultimately expanded to the entire field of the city of Florence in an attempt to create a unified aesthetic of the entire city, the state, as a work of art. We decide, in fact, that they will follow the lead of Filippo Brunelleschi and the Foundling Hospital in 1427. Michelozzo then will add an atrium and a portico onto the church, and then 200 years after that, after the initial design of the Foundling Hospital, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger actually completes over here on the other side of the piazza a sort of mirror image of Brunelleschi's facade. This then objectified the piazza. At some point, an equestrian statue, which we'll see where that comes from in a moment, that we see right here, is placed in the piazza. That's Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici, who was the patron, in fact, of Individual towers were torn down in favor of the single tower, which then unified or symbolized the unity of the entire city. If we look at this, what we see then is that the Uffizi is inserted here to make a connection down to the Arno River. Notice how it's extended out in that orthogonal 90-degree angle there in order to sort of capture K along the river. You'll also notice this, which we will see at the end of this sequence of slides, which was a continuous ground floor arcade with a passageway at the very top that was intended to be used by the Medici, who paid for it, crossing the Ponte Vecchio and down, supposed to connect up to this building, although it was never completed. The space itself that we see here is actually cleared out. A street is struck that we see here so that it actually lines up with the tower, and then statues are commissioned to flank the front of the Palazzo Vecchio, which is the city hall, the town hall that we see right here. Some of these statues are quite well known. This is actually the facade of that, and then we see two of those statues flanking the entrance into the building, and then that street that was realigned so that the termination of the view down the street was in fact the tower of the city hall. Making an immediate 90-degree left turn then, looking down the galleries of the Uffizi, today a very famous art museum, but originally the offices of these merchant princes and the guilds and so on and so forth. And then we see this extraordinary attempt at transparency in a world that cannot make a piece of glass any bigger than this, to kind of push that whole space out to connect down to the river. There we see a little bit better detail. Employing, of course, sort of traditional neoclassical elements, in this case a kind of Tuscan order, which is sitting up here on a base and a stylobate, and then this creating barrel vaults which run down and flanking the central street, on both sides. There we see an aerial view of the relationship of the City Hall to the Uffizi and the Piazza della Signoria, which is expanded out into this area that we see here. Then another straight street exiting the piazza here is connecting up to the front of Santa Maria del Fiore, which we see in the Duomo of Brunelleschi, which we see sort of poking up here on the skyline in the background. This is another detailed shot of that barrel vault running down the right side going toward the river. And then we see that extraordinary degree of transparency, something that in the Middle Ages we would certainly not have seen at all. In fact, we would not have wanted to have any unfiltered light whatsoever coming into that. It would have all been sort of diffuse or stained glass or something else, which would have not allowed the profane light of the everyday world into the space. And then looking here down the river, exiting the Uffizi and across to the Ponte Vecchio, and we see there this sort of passageway that was constructed, never completed, which was intended to make a connection above the street level all the way from the Palazzo Pitti, which was the home of the Medici, the sort of dominant. The Republic was really a shell republic. It was really driven by these wealthy families, the Medici chief among them, many of whom would go on to become popes and so forth, and that will take us back to Rome. So here we see that on the ground floor along the river, and then just a photograph that I sort of like. It's kind of weird, but I kind of like it. And then looking across the Ponte Vecchio, and then an opening in the Ponte Vecchio to the right, which actually affords us a view. There we see the Uffizi sticking out beyond, and where the colonnade, or the arcade, never actually connected up. So this unified field, complete with the Medici's villa that we have here, with a fort designed by Michelangelo and the Palazzo Pitti, and then this axial relationship from this point, which affords a view of the landscape across all of the city that we see there. And then there you see the connection up, how all of this is unified into a single aesthetic experience. There's more of that. You can study these on your own. The city as a unified field. Are there any questions? We'll stop there.